It sounds like a strange question, but stay with me for a second. Did Donald Trump actually affect the food you buy in the UK? At first, it doesn't seem connected at all. Different country, different market, completely separate systems. But when you start looking at how food really works, supply chains, imports, pricing, and competition, you begin to see something interesting. Because during the late 2010s, especially around Trump's presidency, a series of global trade changes started to shift how food moved between countries. And while most people in the UK never noticed it directly, the effects quietly showed up in supermarkets over time. Not as a sudden change, but as small differences, ingredients, availability, pricing, even taste. So this isn't about blaming one person or making it political. It's about understanding how global decisions can ripple into something as everyday as the food on your plate. To understand this properly, you need to look at how much the UK relies on imported food. A significant portion of what you see in supermarkets doesn't originate locally. Ingredients, additives, packaging materials, and even fully prepared products often come from international suppliers. The system is highly interconnected, and small disruptions in one part of the world can affect what ends up on shelves somewhere else. When trade tensions increased between the US and other countries during that period, it didn't just affect those countries directly. It shifted global supply routes. Products that used to go one way were redirected. Prices changed, availability fluctuated, and companies had to adapt quickly. One of the key things that changed was cost pressure. When trade policies shift, even slightly, they can increase the cost of importing certain goods or ingredients. And when that happens, food manufacturers don't just absorb the cost, they adjust. Sometimes they switch suppliers, sometimes they reformulate products. Sometimes they reduce quantities or change ingredient ratios. And again, these aren't dramatic overnight changes. They're subtle, but they add up. Over time, you end up with products that look identical on the outside, but are slightly different on the inside. Maybe the sauce is a bit less rich. Maybe the cheese behaves differently. Maybe the overall flavor just feels less complete. And unless you're paying close attention, it's easy to miss. Another factor is how competition between supermarkets intensifies during uncertain periods. When costs become less predictable, supermarkets focus even more on price positioning. They don't want to be the one that looks expensive compared to competitors, so pressure increases on suppliers to keep costs low. And that pressure feeds back into product quality. Cheaper ingredients become more attractive. Processes get optimized for efficiency. Recipes get simplified. Not because companies want to make worse food, but because they need to stay competitive. And when this happens across multiple brands at the same time, it creates a noticeable shift in the overall quality of food available. At the same time, global supply chains became less stable. When trade relationships shift, logistics becomes more complicated. Shipping routes change. Delays become more common. Certain ingredients become harder to source consistently. And consistency is a big deal in food production. If a manufacturer can't rely on a specific ingredient being available at the same quality and price, they often look for alternatives that are easier to secure. These alternatives might be slightly different in taste or texture, but they offer reliability. And in large-scale food production, reliability often wins over quality. There's also the issue of standardization. Modern food systems prioritize consistency above almost everything else. Consumers expect products to taste the same every time they buy them. But when the underlying ingredients are changing due to global supply shifts, maintaining that consistency becomes more difficult. So companies compensate by using more stabilizers, more flavor adjustments, and more controlled processes. The result is food that is consistent, but also more uniform, less complex, and sometimes less satisfying. It still meets expectations on the surface, but it doesn't deliver the same depth of flavor that people remember. Now, here's where it becomes even more interesting. Because most of these changes are invisible to consumers. You don't see supply chain disruptions when you're walking through a supermarket. You don't see ingredient sourcing decisions when you open a ready meal. All you experience is the final product. And if that product feels slightly different, slightly less satisfying, you might not question why. You might assume it's just your taste changing or that you're imagining it. But in reality, there are layers of decisions behind that product, many of which were influenced by broader global shifts during that period. And this is why the connection to Trump's presidency, while indirect, is still relevant. His administration's trade policies contributed to a period of increased uncertainty in global trade. Tariffs, renegotiations, and shifting alliances all played a role in changing how goods moved around the world. The UK, especially during a time when it was already dealing with its own changes in trade relationships, felt those effects as part of a larger system. Again, this isn't about direct cause and effect in a simple way. It's about understanding how interconnected the system is. When one major player changes the rules, even slightly, the impact spreads outward. But here's the important part. These global factors didn't act alone. They combined with existing trends in the food industry. Cost optimization was already happening. Recipe changes were already happening. Mass production was already prioritizing efficiency over flavor. What the global trade shifts did was accelerate some of these trends. They increased pressure, they reduced flexibility, and they pushed companies further toward solutions that prioritized stability and cost over complexity and taste. So when people say that food in the UK doesn't taste like it used to, they're picking up on something real. Not a single cause, not a single decision, but a combination of factors that have gradually reshaped the food landscape. And while it might seem surprising to connect that back to global politics, once you understand how interconnected everything is, it starts to make sense. The food on your plate isn't just the result of a recipe, it's the result of an entire system, and that system has been changing. To make this more concrete, think about how many products in UK supermarkets depend on global sourcing. Cheese blends, processed meats, sauces, ready meals, they often rely on a mix of ingredients from different countries. When those supply chains shift, even slightly, the final product changes. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel different. A ready meal might still look the same on the packaging, but the sauce could be made with a different base. A frozen pizza might still melt, but the texture of the cheese could feel slightly off. These are the kinds of changes most people don't consciously track, but they notice subconsciously. There's also the question of substitution. When certain ingredients become more expensive or harder to source consistently, manufacturers look for alternatives that behave similarly in production. For example, a higher quality oil might be replaced with a more stable, cheaper option. A natural ingredient might be partially replaced with something processed that delivers similar texture or shelf life. These substitutions are usually designed to maintain the appearance of the product, not necessarily the depth of flavor. So visually, everything looks fine, but when you eat it, something feels slightly less satisfying. Another important factor is timing. These changes didn't happen overnight. They happened gradually, over several years, and that's why they're so difficult to notice clearly. If a product changed completely in 1 month, people would react immediately. But if it changes slightly every year, your expectations adjust alongside it. You adapt without realizing it, and by the time you compare it to how it used to be, the difference feels surprising, even though it was building the entire time. This is also where perception becomes a big part of the experience. When you remember how something used to taste, you're not just remembering flavor, you're remembering context, where you were, how often you had it, how new it felt at the time. Modern versions of those same products are competing with that memory. And even a small drop in quality becomes noticeable when it doesn't match what you expect. That's why people often describe food as feeling flatter or less satisfying today. It's not just about ingredients, it's about the gap between expectation and reality. At the same time, supermarkets have become more focused on efficiency and predictability. They need products that can sit on shelves longer, travel further, and behave consistently across thousands of stores. That naturally favors ingredients and processes that are stable and controllable. But stability often comes at the cost of variation. And variation is a big part of what makes food feel fresh and interesting. When everything is designed to be identical every time, you lose those small differences that make food enjoyable. There's also a shift in how products are positioned. Instead of competing purely on quality, many products compete on convenience and price. Meal deals, ready-to-eat options, quick snacks, they're designed to fit into fast routines. And when convenience becomes the priority, flavor often becomes secondary. Not completely ignored, but adjusted to meet practical constraints. Over time, this changes what people expect from food. It becomes something functional, something quick, rather than something you fully experience. So when you put all of this together, global trade shifts, supply chain adjustments, ingredient substitutions, cost pressure, and changing consumer habits, you start to see the full picture. It's not that one policy or one person suddenly changed UK food. It's that a series of pressures, some global and some local, pushed the system in a direction where consistency, cost, and efficiency became more important than flavor and complexity. And during the late 2000s and 10s, those pressures intensified. This is why the connection to Trump's trade policies is part of the story, but not the whole story. Those policies contributed to a more unstable global trade environment. They added pressure to supply chains. They influenced pricing and availability in indirect ways. But the food industry was already moving in a certain direction, and those external pressures simply accelerated it. They made existing trends more noticeable, more widespread, and harder to avoid. And the result is what many people are experiencing today. Food that looks the same, costs roughly what you expect, and performs the same in terms of convenience, but doesn't quite deliver the same level of satisfaction. It's not bad enough to reject, it's not different enough to immediately question, but it's just enough to feel like something has changed. Once you understand this, you start to notice patterns. You notice which products feel more natural and which feel more processed. You notice when something actually satisfies you and when it just fills a gap. And you start to realize that the difference isn't random. It's the outcome of a system that has been optimized in a very specific way. So the next time something tastes slightly off or doesn't feel as good as you remember, it's worth asking why. Not just assuming it's your taste, but considering what might have changed behind the scenes. Because in many cases, there's a reason, and that reason often goes far beyond the product itself. If you've noticed this with specific foods, it would be interesting to know what stood out to you. And if you want more breakdowns like this, looking at what's actually behind everyday products, you can subscribe. There's a lot happening in the background that most people never see, but once you do, it changes how you